What's up guys, D2 from DTwoALV.com here with an interesting news story for you, but before I get to that, reminding you that I have actually updated both my item guide and who has qualified for the AIC thus far, in particular the main 3 leagues, and if you want to figure out what happened there, go click on the website, go to D2ALV.com, go to my item guide as well. Nearly done with that, finished with the defense items, only have a couple things left to go. Now, what is this? What's going on? New patch comes to Japan server. Usually when there is a new patch, it comes to the Taiwan server first. And if it's not Taiwan, then it's like Vietnam. If it's not Vietnam, it's Thailand. That said, it's not super surprising that it came out in Japan server first. One, because there's been lots of weird craziness and kind of miscommunication between all of the production teams. But also because they're trying to hype up Japan potentially, since it just came out last year, and they're doing a reasonable amount of advertising. I do live in Japan, for those of you who don't know, so this was actually a lot easier for me to translate than the ones that are typically in traditional Chinese, or in other words, basically Taiwanese. But that said, let's get to it. It's not the biggest patch in the world. 9 heroes were changed, with 1 enchantment changed and 1 changed to the core. Now, keep in mind, this has never happened before. There's never been a patch that comes out in Japan first, so I don't know. I have no idea when this is coming to other servers. Every server eventually ends up being the same exact thing, and unless you live in India. So I'm pretty sure this will eventually make it over to your server. But I'm not sure when. One more thing is that there are 3 fewer heroes on the Japan server than even the North American server, which means there's like 6 fewer than like the Taiwan server. So it's possible that they made changes to, like, Chi, for instance. Chi isn't on Japan. That will, so if this patch eventually comes over, then you might see changes to additional heroes as well. All right, let's get to it. I'm just gonna click on this to make it easier to navigate later. So this is my my hero balance rating, as it were. Basically, it's kind of like on a logarithmic scale, I realize, as I've done this, because 2 is very similar to 1 in my opinion, or at least how I go about it. But the jump from 2 to 3 is a lot bigger, and the jump from 3 to 4 is massive. The only time I've ever given someone a 4, I believe, is when Fennec got his massive buff, and it was definitely warranted. He went from literally one of the heroes in the game. Did I say that right? One of the worst heroes in the game to one of the best heroes in the game, which is, yeah. In fact, maybe could have given him a 5, but I don't like, I don't like immediately jumping to that conclusion. In retrospect, it was a 5, but you never know what happens when certain changes take place, which is why this is all my opinion and all conjecture. Anyway, let's get on to the first hero, and that is Necroth. Now, this is kind of funny because there was a nerf, obviously, to Necroth in the September patch, August if you're from Taiwan, and it basically went from 9.6 to 9.6 at level 1 to 55.6 at level 6 to they nerfed it like about a second total, right? And then they nerfed the death sentence, the second ability, from 5 seconds to 6 seconds. Now they're reverting it back, and they're starting to realize that, like, oh, we nerfed Necroth too much. I think, as I write in this paragraph, I was pretty sure that Necroth was already starting to see a little bit of tumble, but they were probably like, looking at data, looking at how often Necroth was being played, and people are still playing him. And sometimes when you have like a small-ish buff and people don't think it's as big as it might be, then people keep playing him until they realize it is crap. Also, the meta just hasn't completely favored Necroth as much. I mean, I don't think that, I think they maybe underestimated how big of a nerf that it was on his second ability quite a bit ago. In any case, I think this is a long-winded way of saying that I think that devs need to be more patient. Sometimes there's like public outcry from the community. But I don't think, in this case, I think they were just kind of overreacting to the data. Like, oh, people are still playing Necroth. I was like, just give it time. He will eventually fall off. As I mean, if you watch Necroth players play, he had a really hard time, especially because he wasn't getting the burst damage that he typically had before. Anyway, so moving along, essentially they reverted the thing from a second nerf to now only half a second nerf. So essentially this is a buff, but I only gave him 1.5 for that. And I mentioned in the previous patch that the reason why I gave him a relatively harsh score is because he's constantly using his abilities. Now he gets a half a second buff, which means, you know, it's 1.5 is actually more than you would expect for this kind of small-ish buff. But because it's in the Karoth and because he needs abilities a lot, that's how much it is. Anyway, moving on to Superman. Superman gets a 1 second buff across the board for Kryptonian strength. And if you guys don't know, if you look at the ability description, it's like, it looks like a typo. It's like, it looks like there was very strong pressure from DC to make like Superman's extremely strong, because at level 6 you're doing like 1500 damage, like base damage. It's absolutely nuts. Not to mention that you're doing, you know, 10% of the opponent's max HP damage in the first place, and that's actually a nerf from what it was before. In any case, the point is, Kryptonian strength does a lot of damage, and having it a second early, I mean, in the early game, this cooldown's pretty long. And even getting that 1 extra second can be difference between life and death. And obviously, it can be difference between life and death in later stages of the game as well. When you're basically running around with Speeding Bullet, you really want to get to, you know, 1 auto off, get the blow off with this Kryptonian strength as well. Or, I mean, usually you don't want to use. I don't play Superman that much, but I've seen a lot of pros play Superman. Usually, it appears you want to get the freezing breath off, not the laser, when you are in the midst of a fight, so that you can get the auto, you know, the enhanced auto, and you get the freezing breath. Anyway, the point is, it's a lot of damage, and that's a big deal. Speeding Bullet obviously got a buff as well. It's 10 seconds early game, 5 seconds from level 8 to 12, and then no buff after that. And that's kind of nice, especially because you're constantly rotating around the map. That could keep you alive potentially if you're in trouble. It could allow you to engage a lot more often, right? Maybe you come over, you help with the Abyssal Dragon, you go back, and then all of a sudden you're, you know, back up ready to fight again. So that's a relatively big deal as well. I think the Kryptonian strength, excuse me, is a bigger deal. Now, as we'll see later, maybe I should, you know what, I'm actually gonna just go skip to this right now, because in fact I probably should have this above everything else, just because this kind of informs all the other changes. Let's talk about Devil's Awakening for a second. So they nerfed it from reducing all the cooldowns of the other ability by 50% immediately to 30% immediately. And obviously, for someone like Superman who has a relatively high cooldown, especially early in the game, with oops, I just click on this, make navigation easier. Because obviously early in the game, you want to reduce this cooldown as much as possible, right? It's, you know, that nerf from 50%, 30% is like a couple seconds. So that's kind of a big deal in Superman. Now, I didn't actually factor that into his score, because there's a lot of DS laners who actually rely on Devil's Awakening. So the fact that he is getting that much stronger in relation to those heroes, and a lot of those heroes are the ones who actually take advantage of Superman very well by using that extra Devil's Awakening. So I didn't want to, it's just too much hassle to keep in mind every single hero that is getting, you know, nerfed by Devil's Awakening. And the fact that he basically overrides that, you know, he's already getting this 1 second buff on his abilities anyway. Plus, he's getting a Speeding Bullet back quicker. So if you think about it that way, then you're getting, you know, you're getting to use your Devil's Awakening a lot more. So in the end, I gave him a nice, healthy 2.5 score. All right, moving on to Raz. This is kind of funny because you can totally tell that they're looking at the data and like no one's playing Raz. And I mean, the answer is obvious for Raz to why no one's playing Raz. It's because at lower levels, it's just easier to play other heroes. Like the payoff is not. It used to be that Raz was so good that, you know, it's worth learning to play him. Now there's so many other heroes that you can just learn to play much easier, and they're just as good as Raz, right? But I would argue in the high levels, there's, you know, there's definitely a place for him, especially in the pros where, you know, he can counter a lot of heroes. He's selectively a very, very nice hero, one of the top in the game because of his ability to both poke and dive. But yeah, he's hard to use, and so they probably saw that in the data, and you can see it in the buffs, quote unquote, that they gave to him, because 2 of the buffs, quote unquote, were to his energy cost. And it's like, I don't think experienced players have any problem with the energy cost on him at all. Like, you never really see his energy run out. So this is like 100% just for the new players out there trying to get used to him, just to make sure that it's not frustrating to play him. Now, his damage did go up. Obviously, in the early game, it's about 50 because you don't have that much ability power in the early game. But in the late game, if you have a relatively full build, depending on what you've built, it's about 200, 250 extra damage. And, you know, that's, Usually not a lot in a particular ability, but because he has power surge up so often, like if you hit 3 of those in a row, that's extra like 700 damage, you know? It can definitely add up, and it can be the difference between someone living or dying. But that all said, I think the biggest thing here is changing the movement speed reduction from 60 to 90% to just a flat 90% the entire game. Like 90% from the beginning of the game is massive. Imagine just having Joker's slow, because that's how much Joker's slow is on his passive. Imagine having Joker's slow on Raz's Fireball, which is, you know, even in the early game, it's relatively low cooldown. And every time you land, it's 90%. Not only that, like if you hit them with one fireball, not only is it easier to hit them with future fireballs, but it's also easier to hit them with the rest of your abilities too, if you have them available to you. So it's just way easier for you to hit that. I was thinking this is going to be way overpowered, but then I remembered that Raz is pretty weak in the early game. Like he has so much trouble clearing waves. He always falls behind in that regard. So I like this. Like if they gave him, you know, randomly like AoE on his power surge, would be way too powerful. So instead they just make it easier for him to duel the opponent, and that way he can kind of like, you know, deal with them in that regard rather than being able to just directly be able to clear the wave faster, right? He can handle himself in the early game as long as he can duel the opponent and kind of make them go away and leave him alone while he clears the rest of the wave. So I gave him a good healthy 2 for that. Mostly due to the extra slow. Lulu is so interesting. So this is a funny one, and you see I wrote a lot on him, and we went with tables and everything. The reason why is because I was looking at it at first glance, it looks like it's ridiculous. It looks like an amazing buff, right? Instead of attacking 5 times, stacks up to 10 times. So 10%, 10 times, that's 100%. There's some quick math for you guys. And also, 5 seconds makes it so much more easy to use. You can, obviously, it's really hard for 5 seconds to be up, right? When you're in the middle of a fight, right? You get to use, you know, your second ability, then your first ability 3 times, and if you're hitting a couple times and your second ability comes up, it's really hard, particularly, you know, in the mid to late stages of the game, to not continue, not to keep your passive up. Whereas 3 seconds before, you know, you use your first, second, third ability, maybe they use 1 dash, and all of a sudden it's already up. And the second one is that now, if you knock someone in the air with a third use of your first ability, instead of knocking them in the air for 0.7 seconds and then and that's it. Now it's there's a stun for a short period after that. Now the funny thing is, so I went on the Japan server and I tested this out. The stun timer actually measures from when they go up into the air to the end of the stun, so it's really easy to see how long the stun is, right? So basically it's about 70% through the stun timer when they land on the ground, and then the stun continues for the extra 0.3 seconds. So it's very easy to see that's 0.3 seconds, is what I'm trying to say. So essentially now it went from a 0.7 second stun to a 1 second stun. There's not a whole lot of difference between stuns and knockups. In fact, I'm forgetting what the difference is right now, but in like if I remember correctly, it's like 95% of the case, it's like the exact same thing. So basically the stun went from 0.7 seconds to 1 second. And yeah, and I read this at the end here, but I'm pretty sure that this is like a reversion of a nerf like a year and a half ago. I'm pretty sure like a year and a half ago they reduced the stun from 1 second to 0.7 seconds, and now they're like cleverly reverting it back by saying, oh no, he gets knocked up and then stunned. It's not a 1 second knockup. Anyway, so anyway, I have a lot of thoughts on this. One is that I like the way that they're doing this, rather than trying to continuously just make his first ability longer and longer and try to revert it back to what it was before. And giving him this extra attack speed kind of puts him in line with the other similar DS laners, which are Omen and Kilogauss. You can kind of argue that Florentino's kind of like that, but I mean, he's kind of like a combo guy. Yeah, it's all auto attacks, but like, he really relies on, I mean, his thing is more like of a combo. He's not really auto attacking. You have to actually get to the flowers to use his lunge, right? Otherwise, and you're not going to just sit there and auto with Florentino. So if you're talking about auto attackers and duelers, I think that he's much more comparable to Omen and Kilogauss. So I started comparing them, and the first thing is that Lulu's passive is based on ability use, not attack. So it's way easier for you to get stacks if you're Omen and Kilogauss. And also, it takes a long time to get to 10 stacks, particularly level 1, right? So, well, level 1 is almost impossible, actually, because you can't really, you level up your 1, you'd have to really space out your first ability to use it properly. Once you get to level 2, I should say, it still takes, you know, 1 use of Impale, then your 3 casts of your first ability, and then that's 4, and then you have to wait for your Impale again, and then, you know, you do it again, and now you're at 8, and then the entire time it's like someone's dead by that point. Someone's 100% dead. Because remember, you have to like land I mean, actually, you only have to use the abilities to get the extra attack speed, but you have to land your autos and your other abilities in order to get the cooldown on Impale. So yeah, someone's dead by that point, and it might be you because you don't have any healing at that early in the game. And then what I mentioned here is that it raises both his skill floor. I mean, every single buff raises skill floor, makes him easier to use, right? But it also raises skill ceiling because now there's, you know, you have to, it's really tough to get to 10 stacks, and you have to be really clever with your usage. You have to weave in your auto attacks between your abilities. Obviously, that's what, you know, good Lulu players have always done, but, you know, recently, perhaps if you just picked up Lulu, you kind of just relied on the extra auto attack speed after using your abilities a few times, and now this really forces you to space it out and make sure that you have your cooldowns in line so that you never 5 seconds between, you know, the time you use your first ability and essentially your fourth ability. And there's also, you know, really good, really funny outplay potential because, you know, particularly if you have something like Desperate Duel, right? And they're attacking you for a while and you're just in this long fight. And usually, you know, the benefits of a fight are the benefits that your opponent or you are receiving are apparent during the fight. Like if your opponent is Omen, right, and they have their thirst up, it's like, oh crap, got to run away now or something. Or like Kilogauss, you know, if he has 5 attacks and he's getting stronger and stronger and stronger, stuff like that. Whereas like no one expects, like, you know, basically 10 seconds after you started the fight that like, oh, finally I'm hitting my stride, I got my 10 stacks in. So you don't really expect anyone to get like that much stronger at that point of the fight, and all of a sudden, you know, Lulu has over 100 attack speed at level 2 is that's not something that you expect. So you can potentially beat him more. This also marries him more to Spear Longinus, which I hate that item so much, but it works so much better with it now because I mean, obviously the stacks match up perfectly with the actually, I'm sorry, I'm getting confused. I'm getting confused with the Desperate Duel. So yeah, so one, he really likes drawn out fights now. So the biggest knock on Spear Longinus is that if you have early burst damage, it's completely wasted. Or the pierce of Spear Longinus is completely wasted, right? Like say for instance, like the worst person to have a Spear Longinus on is like Kriknak, for instance, right? And you might be thinking, why would it be bad? Because he gets multiple, like if you Terrifying Plague and then you use your auto, then you get like multiple stacks. You get like, I think it's like 3 or 4 stacks on one thing. It's like, yeah, but you wasted all your burst when they didn't have any armor pierce and any armor break, right? People really underestimate the amount of damage they're missing out on when your first burst attack doesn't go through, even when it's like a dueler, like you know, like Lulu. But now you're really tempted to just go as long as possible. So, you know, by the time you get your 5 armor break stacks on Spear Longinus, you're like, I'm just getting started. I still have to get to 10 stacks here, and you basically get your 5 you'll get your 5 Spear Longinus stacks by the time you have like, you know, 3 or 4 passive stacks, right? And then from there on you have to keep going, and it's just really funny. The other thing is CDR, and obviously there's like, you know, different. If you have Devil's Awakening, you don't need CDR quite as much, but the CDR is really nice. You know, if for instance, first if you don't have Devil's Awakening, and second, if you need because they nerfed the Devil's Awakening, you might need the CDR still, since the cooldown on its first 2 abilities are still relatively long. So, and then, you know, along those lines, it simultaneously makes Devil's Awakening Desperate Duel better, because you want this damage resistance from Devil's Awakening. You want the CDR to make sure that you're constantly capable of getting to those 10 stacks. But at the same time, Desperate Duel, the stacks of Sphere Longinus and Desperate Duel match up perfectly. The other thing that to realize is that the heal that you get from Desperate Duel is a good way to like keep them baited in, because you definitely need to stay there as long as possible. One thing is that I think a couple of patches ago there was a buff to Conquer, his ultimate, in which you gain 10% of your lost health. So if you combine those two things, and you can really bait in your opponent, get the heal from Desperate Duel, get the heal from your ultimate, and then all of a sudden you're healing a lot from your auto attacks as well, and your you know, abilities in general, and then suddenly you've completely baited them in, and you're attacking ridiculously fast. So there's that. I think both are definitely still viable. I would almost still prefer Devil's Awakening though, because the 10% damage resistance for the first 6 seconds and 3 seconds if you get any kills after that is pretty huge, and it's almost like you want to stay alive as long as possible. The other thing is that the Pierce for Desperate Duel and the Pierce for Sphere Longinus, if you do have those, they're anti-synergistic. It's kind of funny, right? I know I'm going on really long, but whatever. It's kind of funny because if you have Sphere Longinus, you want to hold on, I'm trying to think. So Sphere Longinus, part of Sphere Longinus synergizes very well with Desperate Duel, because the stacks do, first of all. And also because you'll get the CDR with Desperate Duel, but the actual Pierce part of it means the actual Pierce part of it is actually anti-synergistic, right? Because you you subtract obviously the raw armor amount and then the percent. So this 15% ends up being a lot less. Or you could do the math the other way around. The actual armor break ends up being a lot less. One of the two. And then on the other hand, right, if you don't have Sphere Longinus, if you have Devil's Awakening, then you'll want the actual Pierce. But on the other hand, you don't really need the CDR quite as much. So like there's both synergistic stuff and anti-synergistic stuff with both of them, and that can be potentially frustrating. One thing you can do if you're just like, screw Sphere Longinus, I hate that item, you could just go what's it called, the Aegis, and just go with Desperate Duel or something like that. Anyway, let's keep going. The next thing I wanted to point out is that this, if you think about, you know, having, you know, an extra potential 100% extra attack speed. By the way, the maximum is 200%. So it's, you know, seeing this beat go 100% for over 100%. For those of you who don't know, this is not this is not superfluous. It's you can go up to 200% attack speed. So one thing to realize, like, this doesn't necessarily make Lulu better than Kilogauss and Omen, and in fact I would argue that it definitely doesn't. And the way you know that is to look at this these tables. So obviously at level 1, Lulu can go straight to 100%, right? That's amazing. No items at all. Kilogauss can go up to 40. He stops stacking it at 5. And then Omen with his Thirst passive. You might be thinking, wait a second, how do you actually maybe hold on. 1 dun 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 dun. No, yeah, it's 4. You might be thinking, wait, doesn't it take 5 attacks to get to to proc Thirst for Omen? But then you realize that part of his passive is also that he gets an extra auto attack with his 3rd attack, so it's basically 4. So yeah, so if you look at this, like, oh, Lulu looks great, he has so many, but then you realize, wait, these are all reliant on using your abilities and not your attacks. So it's way harder to get to here. And in fact, you might just stop here or even here if you're not very experienced with Lulu, and just kind of blow all your abilities right away. And then you start looking at level 15, and that's where it starts looking pretty bad for Lulu, right? Because I don't know if you guys realize this, but Lulu only goes up by 2% attack speed per level, whereas Kilogauss goes up by 3 and Omen goes up by 4. And obviously that translates into Omen having a whopping 56% attack speed just from his base stats. Just from his base stats. It's absolutely ridiculous, guys. And so, you know, Omen, he's at 56 just from nothing. Like, literally, he could have 0 items. Just boots. Just troll and have boots. And then at level 4, he has 106%. Because that Thirst goes from 25 to 50. So this is why, by the way, Lulu is so ridiculous in the late game. Because his base stats are just absolutely nuts. Not to mention that, you know, his like untouchable or second ability, whatever it's called, is provides him so much resistance as well. And Kilogauss is very similar. He starts at 42, and then because if he goes up 14 every attack, he's quickly up to 112. And by the way, this is not accounting for the fact that you can just pop Gorelord, his ultimate, and you're immediately 112 right from the get-go. And meanwhile, Lulu is stuck here at 28. It takes him a long, long time. I mean, and again, one more time, these are abilities, not auto attacks. So it takes him a long time. You use your 3 casts, and then you're Impale, you're at 4, then finally you're at 8, takes them forever, and then you finally caught up to them, and meanwhile the fight's like nearly over. So again, this is just a long-winded way of saying that, like, at first I looked at it, it looked amazing, and then you take a closer look and it's not that amazing. But there is like a weird situation where you can outplay people. Like if you're just extremely good at Lulu, obviously he's like better in team fights because you can heal off multiple people using your Conquer. And what you can do potentially is just you go in, get Impale. And by the way, it's ability. I was thinking about this for a second too, and it's wrong. It's ability usage on your passive, so you can't just use your Impale and hit 5 people and you suddenly have 5 stacks. That's not how it works. You only have to. It's every time you use an ability. So, but every time you hit somebody with an attack or an ability other than Impale, you get CDR on Impale. So if you're really good at Lulu, then you use Impale, you get in there, you get a bunch of, you almost immediately get Impale back off cooldown, like constantly, because you're hitting multiple people with your autos, with your first ability. Then you're just constantly impaling people, and because you're constantly impaling people, you constantly get your attack speed up, and you're just having this nice positive feedback loop, and all of a sudden you're just smacking them with like a bajillion attack speed, right? That is, like, if you're an amazing Lulu and you have the perfect situation, then that could be possible. But just other than that perfect situation, and in particular, if you're just going 1v1, it is not as big of a buff as you might think it is at first glance. So at the end of all that, it's basically just trying to explain to you guys that I don't think it's going to be as big of a buff as you might believe, or as you might think at first glance, and so therefore I've given him just a 2 for his score. Okay, very long-winded. I need a drink. 1 second. All right. Good news is we're basically almost over. These are very short. All right, Crixie. So Crixie, this is actually interesting because I think this change is already live on Thailand. I'm too lazy to go to the Thailand server just to check Crixie because I'd have to go through the update and everything. But in the last patch, like Vietnam had certain heroes, and then like Taiwan had certain heroes, and then Thailand had certain heroes. But Thailand was the only one to have Crixie, whereas no one else had him. So this is Japan's apparently the second server to get this Crixie change. It's a nerf. The damage early is basically even because she gets 10 here, but she loses 10% ability power. You barely have any ability power in the early game. So it's basically the same thing. In the late game, she loses damage, and that's obviously because of the fact that she was extremely powerful, or is extremely powerful with Devil's Awakening. And I'm pretty sure that the devs were not thinking of that when they came up with Devil's Awakening. They were like, oh, Crixie can just use, Holy Thunder or something. And yeah, Devil's Awakening makes her extremely powerful because she's basically able to use her knock-up and then her Mischief, and then she pops her ult, and then she almost immediately gets another Mischief back, and then her stun is back up, like 1 or 2 seconds after that. So it's extremely strong. So that's why they got rid of a lot of her power, or a lot of her damage in the late game, because she was already getting basically double, what she was from before. And yeah, so it's probably a good change. So when I calculated how much she was affected, so remember when for Superman I did not factor in the Devil's Awakening change, because there's so many other heroes that are affected by it. But for Crixie, I did factor in at least a little bit, because there are very few mid laners who actually use Devil's Awakening, and she uses it by far the best out of any mid laner. I guess you can say L'Oreal, but L'Oreal's kind of fallen off. She hasn't really been in the meta as of very recently. So I did dock her 1.5 in total. The damage is not that big of a deal. I would say this is more. This is like. I would say it's more of the whatchamacallit change. the Devil's Awakening change. Okay, moving on. Slims, he goes from 750 units to 725 units. I'm pretty sure this is just completely the devs looking at the data and seeing like a billion people playing Slims. Like, people love Slims, for instance, or for some reason. And honestly, I think this might actually be the reason. Is like, if they nerf him like by as little as possible, then the graphics teams will put him on the nerfed list, right? And then people will see that. This happens, by the way, this happens in like every single time I go to Reddit, and there's like there's a list, and it says like buffed, and it shows the heroes, nerf shows the heroes, and then people are like, thank God, or like, oh my God, they're buffing, and then like they just go they're like out of their minds, and it's like, you have no idea how big or small these buffs are. And it's like they're just going crazy in the comments. I'm like, what are you guys talking about? This is like the smallest change you've ever seen. Like, you can neither be happy nor sad about this. And even like, I remember one time they tried to say that Murad's change was a nerf. This is like a couple of patches ago, and it was actually a buff because they were nerfing him to make up for the fact that they were debugging him, and the debug was actually a much bigger deal than the actual nerf. It's just hilarious how people react to these things. So this is a long way of me saying that this actually might be a reason why they're barely nerfing Slims, because they're like, too many people are using him. Less people stop using him. Stupid people in lower ranks will look at the thing that says nerfed, and they'll be like, oh, I don't want to play him anymore. or just have the placebo effect that I mentioned earlier, where they think he's worse than he actually is. So because of all that, I gave him a 0. I gave him a 0 because it's no difference. 0.25. It's so small, guys. I can't even, like, if I tried to squeeze my fingers together just to show you, it's like, it's not even a millimeter. It's like on the screen. It's like, actually, a millimeter is kind of big on the screen, huh? It's like a millimeter is like, I'm trying to think. A millimeter is almost 100 units, right? So like on screen, it'd be like 1/3 of a millimeter. It's like 1/3 of a millimeter on your screen, on a big screen. So yeah, it's not that big of a deal. Meanwhile, Fennec. So this is going to be interesting some of you might be like, why did you give Slims a 0? And for this, for basically double the change, I gave a Fennec a -1.5. The difference here is Fennec already got nerfed from 750 to 725, and Slims, I mean, he's still, 725 is still very close to 750, whereas 675 is way off of 750, which is what most of the other marksmen are at. So now he's gonna have a way harder time, especially because like he's not gonna outrange anyone. Not only will he not outrange anyone, like other people who previously were very much outranged by him, like other warriors and what have you, now they are suddenly in range of him. So it makes it a lot harder for Fennec players. Now, if you're familiar with how he's played, you can still play him really well. Like I always used to, when the change for Fennec first came out, I always used to compare him to Tulin, right? You have to get up close and personal to use him properly, and that's what people have learned to do. Is you use your Thief's Mark, you rolling lightning past him, you get a ton of damage, and then you either kill him off or you're just rolling lightning back, right? Either way, you're basically just you have all these iframes that they can't really attack you, and you're also stunning them at the same time. And that's why you're so powerful. Good players will still be able to do that, but it's obviously still really annoying to not have that extra damage, especially when you're like one attack off, or you just want to be able to, especially if you want to just duel in the early game, for instance, if you're in the lane instead of in the jungle, all that kind of stuff. It's going to be a huge pain in the ass, but they can deal with it. But for weaker players, it's just, this might be, I mean, a lot of the weaker players really don't know how to play with him. They just kind of attack from a distance, and this is going to make them a lot more vulnerable. So in the end, even though it's only a 0.5, attack range nerf, I gave him a 1.5. All right, moving on. I talked about Devil's Awakening earlier, which means we need to talk about the core. So core, looking at these two changes. Okay, let's just say what they are first. When minions are not in range of the core, so before the damage to the core is reduced by 75%, now it's going to be 80%. And when the core is regenning, and now goes from 20 to 50. I have no idea, like 20 to 50 what? I don't know what that means, but it obviously is 2.5 times what it was. And I like these changes. When you look at it, you realize what they're going for. So, one, they want to make it a little bit harder to try to kill the core. If it's trying to make it harder to backdoor, for instance, trying to make it harder to like, if there's like, for instance, like 4 people, they're diving on the core with no minions, right? And 1 person spawns. They want to make it easier for like crazy comebacks like that happen. And 2, if you screw up and the core is still alive, then you're screwed, right? Like if everyone dies, someone can't come around from the someone can't respawn and just like Necroth his way to the core and kill it with no minions. It's like that's not possible anymore because it's going to regen a whole lot. So they're trying to basically both make comebacks possible and make it easier to actually come back once you have defended your core, and make it harder for people, or make it more punishing once you fail to kill off the core. Alright, that's going to be it for me, guys. Thank you for watching. I plan on going over the AIC teams before it goes live. I believe that's early next month, early November, that the AIC starts. And the other thing is that hopefully, if I have time, I will try to get some videos out about my item guide. So look forward to those 2 things. Go to DTwoAOV.com. Make sure you subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.